All right, let's dive into this battlefield economics. It sounds kind of dry, right? But trust me, this book is anything but. We're going to unpack the hidden economic forces behind, well, behind wars and conflicts.
Yeah. We tend to think about warfare as like tanks and troops, right? But the reality is it's way more complicated. This book digs into that, how things like supply lines, resources, even debt, they've been shaping the way wars are fought for, well, forever, really.
So it's always been about more than just who has the bigger army.
Oh, absolutely. Even ancient armies were incredibly reliant on logistics. I mean, think about the Roman legions, right? Their
Yeah.
ability to move all those supplies, keep those soldiers fed and equipped. That was key to their success.
Yeah, an army marches on its stomach or
Yeah,
whatever, right?
exactly. And it's not just about feeding them, it's about everything.
Right.
Weapons, armor, you name it. Logistics wins wars. But, warfare and economics, it's not all about ancient history. This book also gets a really interesting perspective on the Italian city-states back in the Renaissance.
Okay, so how does economics play into the Renaissance? I'm drawing a blank.
So back then, those city-states, they were all about using economics for a military advantage. But in a different way than you might think. Instead of having these massive armies they had to pay for year-round, they used mercenaries, basically outsourcing their fighting.
Ah, so they just hired the best soldiers money could buy.
Exactly. Pay them a hefty sum to fight their wars for them. They didn't have to worry about the logistics of maintaining a huge standing army. It was all about financial leverage.
Wow. Outsourcing warfare. That's kind of genius when you think about it.
It was a different time. But things really changed with the Industrial Revolution. That's when the scale of production became everything. Wars weren't just won on battlefields anymore. They were won in factories.
This is where we see that idea of total war come into play, right?
Exactly. Think about World War II, right? The sheer scale of production was mind-boggling. Tanks, planes, ammunition, you name it, they were churning it out. It became as much an economic struggle as a military one.
And today, I mean, those production costs must be insane, especially with all the technology involved.
Oh, it's astronomical. Fighter jets, missile systems, that stuff doesn't come cheap. And that's not even considering the cost of training. Did you know that training just one fighter pilot can cost millions?
Millions. Seriously, for one pilot.
That's right, millions. It really highlights how expensive modern militaries really are. But it's not just about the stuff you see. The weapons and the gear. There are all these indirect economic drivers of conflict, too.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Give me an example.
Think about resources. Oil, for example. It's been a major factor in so many conflicts. Nations need it, so they'll go to great lengths to control it.
It's like follow the money, right? Often leads you straight to the heart of the conflict.
Exactly. And then there's another factor a lot of people don't realize is so important. Debt.
Debt. How does that lead to war?
It's more common than you might think. Throughout history, countries have used force to collect debts, escape bad economic agreements, or even just grab resources to try and get out of debt.
It's like a high-stakes game of economics and coercion all rolled into one.
That's a great way to put it. And it's something to think about the next time you see a conflict in the news. There might be more going on behind the scenes than you realize.
For sure. So we've talked about weapons, training, resources, and even debt. What about the cost of rebuilding after a conflict?
Oh, man. The indirect costs of war, those are huge. Imagine a major conflict. You've got devastated cities, trade networks completely disrupted, and countless people who need help.
It's like the economic aftershocks of the actual fighting.
Exactly. It takes years, sometimes decades to rebuild, and the cost,
Mhm.
well, it can be staggering, which makes you think about unconventional warfare in a whole new light.
Okay, so what do you mean unconventional warfare?
We're talking about situations where smaller, less equipped forces can inflict huge economic damage.
This is where it gets really interesting, right? Guerrilla warfare, cyber attacks, the classic David versus Goliath scenario.
Think about the impact of something as simple as an IED, a relatively cheap device that can disable a tank worth tens of millions of dollars, or even bring down a fighter jet.
It's amazing how those kinds of imbalances in resources can be exploited.
It forces those bigger militaries to adapt, to spend more money on things like counter-IED technology and specialized training. And then, of course, you have cyber warfare.
Which has to be like the ultimate example of asymmetric warfare.
Absolutely. Think about it. A small group of hackers can potentially disrupt a country's infrastructure, mess with their financial
Rob,
systems.
with minimal investment.
Right,
Yep.
exactly. And they can do it from anywhere in the world.
The potential for economic damage is enormous.
And it's not always about causing chaos. Sometimes it's about stealing information, disrupting supply chains. Those ransomware attacks you hear about. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
It's like cyberspace has become this whole other battleground. And the
Mm.
weapons, lines of code, it's like we've created this whole new world of warfare, and we're still trying to figure out the rules.
And the costs. Because it's not just about offense, right? Countries are spending billions, trillions globally trying to protect themselves from these kinds of attacks, building up their defenses in cyberspace.
It's like a whole new arms race, except this time it's digital.
And every time technology advances, the stakes get even higher. We're so reliant on it now for communication, for banking, for just about everything.
Makes you wonder, I mean, if economic strategies can be used to, start wars and stuff, can they be used to prevent them too?
It's a great question, and this book actually gets into that. It talks about some really interesting ways economic tools can be used to, well, basically promote peace and stability.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one of the most effective tools is economic development.
Mm.
Imagine if instead of spending all this money on weapons and armies, we invested in things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, but in developing countries, the places that need it the most.
So you're talking about addressing the root causes of conflict? Like if people have better opportunities, they're less likely to resort to violence.
Exactly. Give them something to lose, a reason to hope for a better future, and they're much less likely to want to fight. It's a win-win for everyone.
Right, because a rising tide lifts all boats, or something like that, right?
Exactly. And then, of course, you have trade. Countries with strong economic ties, they're a lot less likely to go to war with each other. This doesn't make good business sense.
Because then they'd be hurting themselves, too.
It's like they say, if goods don't cross borders, armies will. Create economic interdependence, and suddenly conflict seems a lot less appealing.
So it can work, using economics to prevent war.
It can. And the book talks about the European Union as a perfect example of this. The EU has been incredibly successful at, well, basically keeping the peace among its member states. And a lot of that has to do with their close economic ties.
So there's hope. I mean, for a minute there, this was getting kind of
Oh,
depressing.
absolutely. It's not all doom and gloom. The point is true security. It's not just about having a strong military. It's about having a strong economy, strong relationships with other countries.
It's about understanding that everything's connected, right?
Exactly. Diplomacy, cooperation, those things are just as important as firepower when it comes to creating a more peaceful world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how economics can fuel conflict, but also how it can help prevent it. But what about the future? I mean, where do we go from here? What does the book say about all of this?
What ends with a question, a really interesting one, actually, and it gets right to the heart of what we've been discussing. It says, as artificial intelligence, AI, and autonomous weapons become more prevalent on the battlefield, how will they reshape the cost-benefit analysis of warfare? And what ethical and economic challenges will this pose for global security?
AI on the battlefield. Machines making life or death decisions.
Yeah,
That's a whole other level.
it really is. It's the next frontier of warfare, and it raises a whole new set of questions.
Like, will it make war more likely or less likely?
Exactly. It's hard to say. On the one hand, if you have AI fighting your wars for you, if you can minimize human casualties, well, it might make some leaders more likely to use force. Think about it. If there's no political cost, no public outcry because you're not losing soldiers,
That's terrifying.
that's a scary thought. But then on the other hand, AI could also make war less likely.
How so?
Well, AI introduces so much complexity, so much uncertainty. I mean, imagine AI systems from different countries battling it out on the battlefield, each one making decisions based on these algorithms that even their creators don't fully understand.
It'd be like a chess match played at warp speed. Nobody can really predict the outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which could make leaders think twice about starting a war in the first place.
Yeah.
Why risk it if you have no idea what's going to happen?
Right. Plus, there's the whole ethical side of things.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. We're talking about machines making life and death decisions, target selection, engagement protocols. It's all potentially controlled by algorithms. And that raises a ton of ethical questions.
No easy answers there.
Not at all. And that's why this book is so important. It's not just about understanding the economic impact of AI on warfare. It's about the ethical considerations, too. And those are questions we all need to be thinking about, not just the policymakers and the generals.
Because this technology, it's going to impact all of us, one way or another.
Exactly. And the choices we make today about how we develop AI, how we use it, those choices will have profound consequences down the line. It's up to all of us to make sure those consequences are positive ones.
So what can we do? I mean, it all seems so big and complicated.
It is big, it is complicated, but that doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and do nothing. We need to be informed. We need to be asking those tough questions, and we need to be holding our leaders accountable for the choices they make.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and never be afraid to ask those tough questions.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. Right.
Always. Well, on that note, I think we've done a pretty great job of, well, kind of unpacking this whole thing, right? The economics of warfare, the impact of technology.
We've only just scratched the surface.
True. But hopefully it gave our listeners something to think about.
I hope so. Because like we said, it's not just about understanding the past. It's about shaping the future.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. It's been, well, enlightening, to say the least. And remember, the next time you hear about some conflict brewing, don't just take it at face value. Think about the economic forces at play. Think about the costs. And think about the potential consequences. Because there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Always.
Until next time.